All right, today we're out here in Elisa Woods. Right now we're climbing up to the top. We're gonna do a few drops and we're gonna go over the Fox DHX2. I switched from an air shock to the DHX2 a couple months ago. I've been really happy so far with the results. It feels, in my opinion, a lot better than an air shock. A lot of that has to do with the Tracer suspension curve. It's got a progressive suspension curve, so the linear coil shock complements very well. Whereas if you had a bike that had a very linear compression curve, you might risk bottoming out a coil shock. If you haven't seen any of my other videos, go down to the channel page, check them out. If you like what you see, make sure you subscribe to the channel. So the DHX2 eats up a lot of this chatter, like the smaller stuff. I feel so much better than my air shock did. It's just way more like sensitive over the small stuff. And since the Tracer has a progressive leverage curve, it really doesn't sacrifice much on the big hits. Yeah, it does in this rock garden. Chain loose. So my chain got bucked off in there, but my rear suspension felt good. So you see that rock garden's a pretty chunky, chattery section of the trail, and this thing just ate it up. Pretty nice, all things considered. One thing that's been nice about this new shock for me, and if you're coming from like a Float X2 or something, it's very similar, but there's so many like adjustment settings for the high speed and low speed, both compression and rebound. It makes it kind of intimidating to set up at first, especially if you're like me and you're not super dialed when it comes to setting up your suspension. But once you start playing around with it and get the feel for it, it's really nice to have all those settings. You can really dial it in. So one thing that's really important about coil shocks, if you've never ridden one and you're coming from an air shock, is to get the right spring rate. Unlike an air shock where you adjust your spring rate with a pump, the coil shocks, your spring rate is literally a spring. So it's super important to get the right spring for your body weight. Otherwise, a few things will happen. You'll be sitting way too high in the sag if your spring's too high, and it will really mess with like the way your bike feels. It'll feel kind of harsh. And if your spring rate not firm enough, you'll be sitting way too low in your sag and you can bottom it out. And your pedaling will be all jacked up and all sorts. Now, if it's too low and you're sitting too low in the sag, you can give it a couple turns of preload, which is this little spring or this little like washer essentially that compresses the spring a little bit and stiffens it up a little bit. So climbing with the DHX2, I would recommend getting one with a climb switch, just because I have noticed if I don't have a climb switch on, I do get a little more pedal bob than I would on my Monarch Plus. With that being said, the climb switch on it itself, it truly locks this thing out. It's way more locked out with a climb switch than my Monarch Plus was. So there's tons of brake bumps on this run, 5 Oaks. Drop. They feel all right with this DHX2. Don't feel as bad as I could. Woo, so bumpy. But even through all this chatter, this DHX2, it finds traction somehow. I've heard people describe it as feeling glued to the ground, and it really does kind of give off that feeling a little bit. It just feels very composed. Over some gnarly stuff. So you can get the DHX2 in a couple different setups. The one I got here has a climb switch, which is nice. If you're looking in the used market and you find one without a climb switch, it's not the end of the world. You can buy a climb switch aftermarket and put it on. Just know I think it's like over $100. And then you can get this with either the SLS spring right here, or it's a standard spring. The SLS spring is, I believe it stands for super light steel, and it's a little bit lighter than the other springs out there, which is nice because putting this DHX2 on my bike did add about a half pound. It's going to be different depending on what shock you have on your bike at the time, but just know that it probably will add a little bit of weight.